On a dusty Wyoming trail, Reuben Carver finds a barefoot woman with her head wrapped in burlap, hands bound, and voice trembling. She whispers, "Don't take it off." Folks say she's cursed, scarred beyond saving. But Reuben, a widowed cowboy who's known silence himself, doesn't walk away. He offers her food, a shed, a place to breathe. Then he finds a little boy hiding nearby and realizes she's not alone, and neither is he. When the burlap sack is buried and her face finally seen, everything changes. Can scars truly make space for something new? Drop a comment if you believe healing can grow where shame was planted. The sun sat mean over Pine Hollow, flattening the world in heat and silence. Reuben Carver pulled his horse to a halt at the edge of the South Ridge, where the dust drifted slow, like smoke over coals. He wiped his brow and squinted toward the cottonwoods. That's when he saw her. A figure, slight and barefoot, hunched near the trail like she'd been poured there by the wind. Her head was wrapped in a coarse burlap sack, cinched tight below the chin. Her arms hung limp, wrists bound in front with rope rubbed raw. The dress she wore, if you could call it that, was torn up the side, more thread than fabric. And yet, she stood, silent, breathing, facing the ground. Reuben eased off his horse, boots hitting dirt without a sound. He didn't speak at first, just studied her. She wasn't trembling, she wasn't crying, she wasn't begging either. "You all right, miss?" he said gently. She flinched at his voice but didn't lift her head. "You need water? Food?" Her voice came low and cracked. "Don't take it off." He stepped back, unsettled by how she said it, like it was more warning than request. "I won't," he said, "but you can't stay out here." No answer. He didn't press. Reuben Carver wasn't the type to force a scared soul into light. So he turned his horse and walked slow, watching the woman from the corner of his eye, expecting her to vanish the moment he blinked. But she followed, not close, not even within reach. She stayed 20 paces back, head down, steps dragging like her feet had forgotten how to lift. But she followed, through the switchgrass, over the creek bed, all the way to the edge of his property. Reuben led her to the shed behind the horse stall. It wasn't much, just a slanted roof, one door, and an old quilt folded in the corner. He set a canteen near the step, then a tin plate with jerky and cornbread. "You're safe here," he said, "for now." She didn't respond, just sat in the doorway like a ghost who hadn't decided whether to stay. That night, Reuben didn't sleep in the house. He lit a lantern and sat on his porch with his rifle across his lap. He wasn't sure if he was guarding her or guarding himself from what might come next. Owls called once or twice. The wind ran dry fingers through the cottonwoods, but nothing stirred by the shed, not even a cough. He dozed just past midnight, woke cold and stiff with his neck bent wrong. The sky had begun to pale when he heard it. A whisper, not hers. Something moved behind the shed. Reuben rose slowly, boots silent on the steps, and crept toward the back of the horse stall. He stepped around the corner and stopped dead. There, curled in the space between the back wall and the woodpile, was a child. A boy, maybe 6 or 7, face streaked with mud, eyes wide as the moon. He clutched a sack nearly identical to hers. "Don't take it off," he whispered. Reuben crouched low. "It's all right, son. You hungry?" The boy nodded once, then twice, quick as a rabbit. "Come on, then." He led the boy inside, poured milk into a chipped mug, and slid over a biscuit with honey. The child devoured it without looking up. "She your kin?" Reuben asked. The boy's voice came around a mouthful. "My sister." "Your name?" "Jasper." Reuben nodded slowly. "Mine's Reuben." "You're safe here." Jasper paused. "You ain't gonna send us back?" Reuben shook his head. "Ain't nobody belongs in a sack." The boy's lip trembled, then steadied. "They said she's cursed, said she's evil." Reuben looked out the window, toward the shed where the woman still sat in silence. "I've seen evil, son. That ain't what it looks like." By the time the morning sun pushed gold through the trees, Reuben had built a curtain across the open side of the stall. Not a wall, just a little softness between them and the rest of the world. But by noon, the whispers had started. At the general store, behind cracked windows and barrels of beans, someone muttered, "Reuben Carver's hiding a devil in his barn." And Pine Hollow had never liked devils they couldn't name. Reuben Carver had seen his share of wounded creatures, wild horses spooked half to death, coyotes gnawed near blind from traps. But nothing quite prepared him for the way that little boy sat on his porch the next morning, legs pulled to his chest, shirt still stiff with last night's mud, staring at the steam rising from a chipped tin cup of coffee like it might bite him. Jasper hadn't spoken again, since the shed. Reuben didn't push. He laid out breakfast, grits with molasses and a single fried egg, and gave the boy space. The girl, his sister, still hadn't moved from the corner stall. She ate what was left without a word and never looked up. Mid-morning, Reuben gathered wood, fixed the back gate hinge, and hammered a loose porch board. All the while, Jasper trailed him like a shadow, too quiet for his age. When the wind kicked up, the boy winced, clutching the burlap sack like a blanket. "You ever go to school?" Reuben asked, not turning. Jasper gave the faintest shake of his head. "You read it all?" This time a whisper. "A little." Reuben wiped his hands on a rag and pointed toward the bench near the garden. "Sit. I got something." He came back with an old primer Sarah, his late wife, had used when tutoring the neighbor's girl years ago. Dog-eared, sun-faded, the cover barely holding, but the letters were clear. "Start here." Reuben tapped the first page. "You get stuck, ask." Jasper blinked, up at him, unsure. Reuben didn't wait for thanks. He went back to splitting logs. By lunchtime, the boy had made it to page 7. When the sun dropped low behind the cottonwoods, Reuben finally sat across from him and asked, "What happened?" Jasper's mouth opened, then closed. His fingers curled around the book like it might float away. Finally, he whispered, "They didn't want us." Reuben stayed still. "They said June was bad luck, that she'd bring sickness, said her face made babies cry." Reuben's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "They tied her up when she started to talk back, took her sack off once, when she was little. Folks screamed. Pa said she was cursed, said he wished she'd never been born." Reuben looked toward the shed. Jasper's voice dropped. "She ran when they said they were going to sell her to some man in Jackson. I followed. We got lost. Walked for days." Reuben rubbed a hand down his face. "And your name's Jasper. Her name's June." The boy nodded. "But don't tell her I told." Reuben stood. "You two stay here for now. I won't let nobody hurt her." Jasper looked up sharply. "You mean it?" "I don't say what I don't mean." That afternoon, Reuben hung a heavy canvas curtain between the stall and the open shed door, just enough for June to feel like she wasn't on display. He swept the floor, folded fresh linens nearby, and brought a second pillow from the house. He didn't see her face, didn't hear her voice. But that night, when he left a bowl of stew and corn biscuits at the edge of her space, something changed. The next morning, the bowl was scraped clean, and someone had folded the blanket at the foot of the stall. Reuben saddled his horse and rode into town for seed and salt. At the general store, folks eyed him as he paid. "Still got that visitor?" the shopkeep asked with a tilt of the head. Reuben packed the sack tight and slung it over his shoulder. "That your business?" he said plainly. The shopkeep raised his hands. "Just heard talk. Word is, she's not. Natural. Head wrapped like that? Sounds like devil business to me." Reuben turned to leave, boots echoing on the wood. One old man muttered near the barrels of oats, "He's hiding a devil in his barn." Reuben didn't answer, but he walked out slower, spine straight, and when he mounted his horse, he looked toward the church steeple. If folks feared what they didn't understand, then Pine Hollow was about to have themselves a reckoning, and it was coming quiet, one scarred girl and one steady man at a time. It was just after sunrise when Reuben noticed the shift. The shed door stood open, and the curtain he'd hung swayed with the breeze. The feed pail was empty, and the folded quilt remained untouched. But something was missing. The burlap sack. He circled the back of the shed, scanning the dew-dark grass and the creek beyond it. That's when he saw it, half buried beneath the base of the old cypress, the burlap folded and pressed under a stone. A choice, not an accident. Reuben didn't move closer, just tipped his hat and whispered, "All right then." When he returned to the house, she was already there, standing barefoot on the porch, her shoulders squared, chin lifted. June. He hadn't seen her face before, not truly. It wasn't easy to look at. Burn scars stretched across her left cheek and jaw, tracing down her neck like rivers frozen in mid-flood. Her right eye was clouded, but her other eye, dark and wide, met his with a steadiness that held. He didn't flinch. He opened the door and stepped aside. "You hungry?" She nodded once. Inside, Jasper sat at the table with a book open and half a biscuit hanging from his mouth. When he looked up and saw her, his face lit like summer lightning. "June!" She crossed to him fast and knelt, touching his cheek with careful fingers. "You all right?" He nodded furiously, then wrapped his arms around her. "I knew you'd be brave. I knew it." Reuben kept to the stove, pouring coffee and turning eggs. He didn't interrupt. After breakfast, he handed June a flannel shirt, one of Sarah's, from the back closet, and a pair of gardening gloves. "There's a patch of land east of the coop," he said. "Soft ground. Good for herbs." June took the shirt, but paused at the gloves. "I ain't scared of dirt," she said softly. Reuben gave a quiet nod. "Didn't figure you were." That afternoon, she cleared weeds in silence while Jasper read aloud from the primer, stumbling over words like pioneer and porch. June corrected him only once when he skipped the word hope. "It matters," she said, patting his knee. By supper time, she'd planted thyme, yarrow, and a tiny start of lemon balm. Jasper laid smooth stones around the edges to mark it as theirs. As the sun slipped behind the ridgeline, Reuben brought out an old rocking chair from the barn. He set it on the porch beside his and motioned to June. "Yours, if you want it." She sat slowly, adjusting the cushion beneath her. "It was Sarah's," he added after a pause. June didn't answer right away. Then she looked at him, voice quiet but sure. "I won't replace nobody." "You're not meant to," he said. The wind picked up then, and somewhere down the road, a dog barked. Jasper yawned and leaned against the doorframe, blinking slow. "I'll get him to bed," June said, rising. As they went inside, Reuben lingered on the porch. He looked toward the old cypress. That buried sack wasn't just a symbol. It was a line drawn, and lines, once drawn, invited trouble. He was right to worry. The next morning, two strangers loitered outside the blacksmith's. Reuben spotted them while trading eggs for flour. One of them had a voice like gravel and laughed too loud. The other wore a buckle that didn't match his boots. As Reuben passed, he caught just one line. "Heard she's hiding out west." When he got home, June was finishing laundry with Jasper by the creek. "Anyone ever tell you about 4 men?" Reuben asked, tone level. She stilled. "Brothers." "Coming this way?" She didn't answer. But that night, Reuben lit the lantern on the porch and oiled the rifle he hadn't touched in a year. The shed stood empty now. June and Jasper had moved into the lean-to beside the cabin. Still modest, still tucked away, but not hidden. And by the back steps, a coat hung neatly on a peg. Next to it, a pair of gloves. And on the porch rail, where sunlight would hit it come morning, someone had carved a single name into the wood. June, like she was meant to stay. Sunday came hot and humming with cicadas. Reuben hadn't planned on going to the founders' picnic, not with the way folks had been looking at him lately, but Jasper had pressed his best shirt and said, "You promised I could try Miss Clara's peach water." And June, quiet and brave in her way, had laid out her own dress, a pale blue one she'd sewn from Reuben's old curtain linen. She even wore the wide-brimmed straw hat Reuben had left by the door. They walked to the town square together, Reuben with Jasper's hand in his, June a few steps behind, the breeze catching her skirt just enough to remind everyone she didn't care to hide anymore. The picnic buzzed with noise, kids chasing hoops, women balancing peach cobblers, men squinting into card games under shaded tents. Music played from the church steps, fiddle and banjo, just lively enough to keep tension at bay. That is, until they arrived. Conversation dipped, like the whole gathering had sucked in its breath. Reuben nodded to a few familiar faces, Mrs. Applegate near the pie table, Mr. Trent over by the lemonade barrel. Some nodded back, others looked away. Jasper made a beeline for the drinks. Reuben watched him go, then turned to June. "You all right?" "I've been stared at before," she said. "But never like this. This time it's with names attached." "You got a name now," Reuben said gently, "and you carved it yourself." June gave the barest smile. "Ain't that something?" They made their way to the long tables, sat near the end where the sun caught the edge of the gingham cloth. Reuben passed June a plate and poured sweet tea. Across from them, two ranch hands shifted uneasily. "She really just gonna sit here?" one whispered. The other gave a low snort. "You asking her to leave?" They didn't, but they didn't stay long either. A few tables over, the preacher's wife, tall and prim with a starched collar high to her chin, turned her voice just loud enough. They ought to be ashamed showing her face like that. Reuben set down his fork. June touched his arm. Don't, she said. You told me not every fight needs your fists. I didn't bring fists, he said, standing. I brought cornbread. But he didn't speak to the woman. He picked up a plate, walked over to Miss Clara's stand, and came back with a paper cone of peach water and a generous slice of pie for June. Quiet answers to loud mouths. For a moment, it seemed the heat had passed. Then someone shouted, "Watch out!" A rock arced from the far edge of the square, aimed low, too fast for Reuben to react, too slow to stop. Jasper was walking back with a second cup of peach water when it hit. Only, it didn't hit him. June had stepped in front of him. The stone struck her shoulder with a dull thud. She didn't flinch, didn't cry out, just steadied herself, pressed a hand to the bruise, and looked toward the crowd. No one moved. Jasper dropped his cup, ran to her side. You okay? June nodded once, then looked at Reuben. Still worth showing up? He met her gaze, jaw tight. More now than ever. They didn't stay much longer. Jasper clutched June's hand the whole way home. That night, as dusk deepened and the porch lights flickered on, Reuben heard a knock at the gate. It was Deputy Harlan, young, blond, unsure of his badge. He held his hat like it might burn. "Mr. Carver," he said, eyes flicking toward the house. "Mind if I ask a few questions?" Reuben stepped onto the porch. "About what?" The deputy cleared his throat. "Just about who's staying here. Couple folks saw you leave with that woman, and now folks are nervous." Reuben leaned against the post. "Well, Harlan," he said, slow and firm. "She's got a name. It's June. She stays here. That make you nervous?" The deputy hesitated. "No, sir," he said at last. "Then we ain't got a problem," Reuben said. "Unless you want one." Harlan tipped his hat and backed away, boots crunching soft in the dirt. Inside, June rocked slowly in her chair. Reuben didn't say anything else. He just sat beside her, close enough that the silence didn't feel so big. But the shadows were lengthening, and somewhere in them, hoofbeats would be coming. It started with laughter, sharp and ugly, carried on the wind from the east road. Reuben was chopping kindling near the coop when he heard it. Too many hooves, too many boots. He stepped onto the porch, wiping sweat from his brow just as June froze in the garden. Her hands, halfway through tying up a stalk of lemon balm, gripped the twine like a lifeline. She didn't look toward the sound. She didn't have to. Jasper, who had been drawing chalk shapes on the porch boards, saw her face and went still. They came, into view like shadows cut from leather. 4 men, all wide in the shoulders and slow in the saddle, like they owned the ground they rode over. One wore a bowler hat that didn't fit right. Another chewed a toothpick, jaw twitching. They dismounted without a word. "Well, well," said the tallest, swaggering forward. "Ain't this a cozy little setup?" June stood up, wiping her hands on her apron. "Nathan, West, Tommy, Joel," the men grinned. "You remember us, sis. That's sweet," Nathan said, "though I reckon we preferred you quieter and covered." Jasper backed toward Reuben, his hand catching the hem of his shirt. Reuben didn't move from the steps. He set the hatchet down gently, stepped inside the cabin, and returned holding a long, well-kept rifle. He rested it across both arms, didn't raise it, didn't need to. "She ain't going nowhere with you," he said flatly. Nathan laughed. "Ain't up to you, old man." "She's free. I reckon she's proved that." Wes spat. "She ain't free. She's running, same as always." June stepped forward, slow and measured, until she stood at the foot of the porch. "I didn't run from you. I survived you." Nathan's grin faltered. "I know what y'all did," she said, voice clear. "Selling me, tying me up, saying God made me wrong so you could sleep at night." Tommy shifted. Joel looked at his boots. Reuben watched, silent. "I buried that sack under a cypress tree," June said, eyes hard. "And you know what grew over it? Wildflowers. Y'all didn't kill me. You just taught me what roots feel like." Wes stepped forward. "You think you're better now, parading around like you belong?" "I don't think it," she said. "I know it." Reuben lifted the rifle slightly. "You heard her." Nathan's lip curled. "We could drag her out of here. But you won't," Reuben said, stepping down. "Because if you touch one board of this porch, I'll call every neighbor from Pine Hollow to Big Rock, and I'll tell them what you did to a little girl, what you let happen to your own kin." Silence cracked between them like dry branches. Then June did something no one expected. She stepped onto the porch, into the light, and turned her full face to them, burned scars, clouded eye, and all. "This is me," she said, "and I ain't hiding no more." For the first time they looked away, even Nathan, especially Nathan. "You're dead to us," Wes muttered, retreating to his horse. June didn't answer. She didn't need to. The four brothers rode off without another word, dust kicking up behind them. Jasper let out a breath like he'd been holding it for a week. Reuben lowered the rifle, leaned it gently against the porch rail, and said nothing. He didn't need to. June sat in the rocker beside the door. Her shoulder ached from where the stone had hit her 2 days ago, but she sat tall. That night, Reuben patched a leak in the porch roof, while Jasper read aloud from the primer by lantern light. June stitched a tear in the curtain beside her bed. And outside, the dust settled. But the echoes of that moment, the way she'd stood tall and called herself whole, would settle into the floorboards, into the bones of the place, into the heart of a man who had once only spoken to fences and wind. The brothers didn't come back the next day, but their echoes did. By Monday morning, word had spread through Pine Hollow like wildfire in a dry wind. Folks didn't say her name, just that woman, the scarred one, the witch Reuben Carver was harboring, the one who didn't flinch at stones or men or shame. Reuben noticed it at the feed store first. He stepped inside for seed oats, but the owner, Mr. Collis, stood stiff behind the counter, his ledger already closed. "Loans on hold," he said, eyes lowered. "Bank's asking questions." Reuben gave a slow nod. "That so?" "No offense, Reuben. Just best you lay low." "Been doing that for years," Reuben said. "Didn't help much." He left empty-handed. Back at the ranch, June was hanging laundry, arms bare in the sun. Her shoulder, still bruised from the rock at the picnic, moved stiffly. But she didn't complain. She never had. Jasper sat on the porch, carving the letter J into a piece of scrap pine. He'd picked up the habit from Reuben, whittling when thoughts got too big to hold. Inside, Reuben reread the numbers in his ledger. Not good. Seed loan was supposed to cover 3 more acres. The hands he'd paid last season weren't coming back. One had left a note nailed to the fence. "No cursed land for me." That night, Reuben dragged a hoe and lantern to the far patch and began tilling the earth himself. By the time the moon rose high, June came out with a cool rag for his neck and a cup of water. "You don't have to save it alone," she said. Reuben looked up at her, dirt on his hands, the ache of age in his shoulders. "Ain't used to someone helpin'." "Well," she said, kneeling beside him, "get used to it." They worked in silence after that, 2 shadows under the moonlight. By week's end, June had opened something of her own, a sewing circle, quiet at first. Just one girl, Ellie, Macklin, sent by her mother after a soft knock at the gate. Then another, Sarah Dietz, who brought scraps of gingham and a nervous smile. They sat on the porch beneath the patched awning, June teaching them how to stitch hems, bind seams, fix tiers. She didn't talk much, but her hands did. "She shows me how to fix what ain't perfect," Ellie said one afternoon. "Not hide it, just make it strong." Jasper grinned at that. That's her superpower. But not everyone saw it that way. Late one evening, Reuben came home from the stream with 2 trout and found a smell on the wind, sharp and wrong. Blood. He followed the trail to the front door. Red streaks slashed across the wood. At the base of the steps, a dead chicken, throat cut, lay with feathers soaked. June stood just inside, holding Jasper tight. Reuben crouched low, eyes scanning the trees. No sign of movement, just the long hum of a summer night filled with menace. He washed the blood away with water from the rain barrel. Then he tore up the front, board where the stains had set, and laid it gently aside on the porch. "Why take it out?" Jasper asked. Reuben ran a hand over the boy's hair. "Because when we stand before town, I want 'em to see what folks think courage looks like." That night, he wrote a letter, folded it once, tucked it under his hat. June found him on the porch after midnight. "You think it's them?" she asked. Reuben didn't answer, just looked at the stars. "Doesn't matter. Cowards never walk through the front gate, but I will." She sat beside him. He looked at her, his voice low. "They want you afraid." "I was," she whispered. "But you gave me a porch." "That's more than they ever gave me." He nodded once. And in the silence that followed, it became clear. She wasn't just stitching cloth. She was stitching something back together, in him, in Jasper, and in herself. But storms didn't end just because someone stood tall. Sometimes they gathered in the rafters, waiting. The board from Reuben's porch sat on the back of his buckboard, wagon like a coffin plank, blood-stained, rough, unvarnished. It didn't need polish. It needed to be seen. Reuben hitched the wagon just after sunrise, boots tight, shirt clean, hat pulled low. June tied her shawl close around her shoulders, not to hide, but for the wind. Jasper rode between them on the seat, his small hands fidgeting with the worn strap of Reuben's saddlebag. They didn't speak much on the ride into town. By the time they reached Pine Hollow's meeting hall, the benches were half full. The mayor, Eldon Barrett, who preferred diplomacy over dust, stood near the front, adjusting his tie and pretending he hadn't noticed the hush that fell when Reuben stepped through the doorway with June and Jasper in tow. The room held ranchers, merchants, 2 church elders, and half the ladies who ran the general store baking committees. They all turned at once. Some stared, some looked away, some leaned in, whispering the same old question, why bring her here? Reuben didn't flinch. He walked straight to the front, laid the blood-stained board flat on the floor, and said with a voice even as iron, "This is what was nailed to my door, last night, after y'all talked your talk." Someone coughed. Another shifted in their seat. June stood just behind him, still, composed. Jasper stood a few feet to the side, arms crossed like his chest wasn't done growing into its courage yet. Mayor Barrett cleared his throat. "Now, Mr. Carver," Reuben cut him off. "No speeches today, just truth." He stepped aside and nodded to June. She stepped forward, hands steady. Her voice didn't shake. "I was born June Parker. My brothers sold me like livestock when I was 14. Said I brought shame to our family when I got burned in a fire they started." A ripple of discomfort passed through the room. "They wrapped my face in burlap so folks wouldn't have to look at what they'd done. Called it mercy. I wore that sack for 5 years. She paused, looked each person dead in the eye. "Now I don't. That's not a crime." Silence. "I didn't come to your town to make noise. I came to breathe. I teach girls how to sew. I feed a boy who's scared of every creak in the floor. I make biscuits on Sundays. That's it." Another pause. "You don't have to like me, but you don't get to mark my door like I'm a plague, neither." Barrett opened his mouth again, but this time someone else rose. Mrs. Kessler, gray-haired, proud-spined, and usually silent, stood from the third row and walked forward. "My daughter Lydia," she said, voice calm. "She's been stitching with Miss June. Learned more in 3 weeks than she did all last year. Says she feels calm in her presence. That means something." Then Mrs. Applegate stood. Then Miss Clara. Then Ellie Macklin's mother. One by one. Mayor Barrett held up both hands. "Let it be known," he said, "that this council does not condone threats nor vigilante behavior. If anyone here has concerns, they bring 'em lawful, or not at all." Reuben gave a single nod, picked up the board, and turned. But then a different voice rang out. "She ain't brave, she's poison." Everyone turned. It was Joel Parker, June's youngest brother. He stood in the doorway, face red, voice shaking. "She ruined our family." June didn't blink. "You ruined it when you watched them tie me up and did nothing." Joel looked around, but this time no one backed him. Sheriff Danvers stepped in behind him. "Joel Parker," he said, hand resting near his belt. "You've been warned. Step out now or step into cuffs." Joel hesitated, then turned and left. That night, Reuben burned the porch board behind the barn. June stood beside him, Jasper holding her hand. "You still afraid?" she asked. Reuben shook his head. "No, ma'am," he said. "I'm waiting." "For what?" "For this town to stop whispering and start seeing. And if they don't," June smiled faintly, "we'll build anyway." The flames crackled like thunder beneath the stars. The next morning, Pine Hollow woke to the news. Joel Parker and his brothers had ridden back into town. They weren't subtle about it. 4 horses clattered past the feed store, past the schoolhouse, past the sewing circle porch where June had just begun teaching little Lydia Kessler how to mend a dress hem. The girls stiffened. June's hands paused mid-stitch. "They're not here for sewing," Lydia whispered. "No, they're not," June said calmly, but her fingers resumed threading the needle. That same hour, Reuben stood outside the sheriff's office. having left a sealed packet with Sheriff Danvers the night before. Inside it was a single-page testimony, what he'd seen, what June had said, what Jasper had whispered in his sleep. It also held something more powerful than a gun, Reuben's name, written clearly at the bottom. "You sure about this?" Danvers had asked. Reuben had nodded. "I don't shoot ghosts. I name them." Now, the Parkers sat in the saloon, swigging cheap whiskey and muttering about revenge. Joel slammed his mug down loud enough for passers-by to hear. "Ain't no scarred witch gonna shame me?" in front of that town again. "Ain't over yet." Trouble was, it was. Sheriff Danvers walked in, calm as a Sunday preacher, hat under one arm. "Joel Parker, Nathan Parker, West, Tommy. I've got a signed complaint, 3 sworn affidavits, and a deputy who saw bruises on a boy you claimed weren't yours." The room stilled. Even the barkeep stopped wiping the counter. Joel stood slowly. "This is a family matter." Danvers didn't blink. "Not anymore." One by one, the sheriff read the charges: unlawful restraint, abuse, fraud, and misreporting a death. Nathan laughed dryly. "This town gonna pick her over blood?" Danvers held up a hand. "This town ain't pickin'. The law is." As he cuffed Joel, one of the bar's older patrons finally muttered, "About time someone said it out loud." Back at the ranch, June heard the distant clatter of hooves fading, not approaching. Jasper came running down the path, wide-eyed. "Sheriff got him," he shouted, breathless. "All 4. June put down the dress hem, walked to the edge of the porch, and exhaled like she hadn't breathed easy in years. When Reuben returned that evening, he found her in the garden, sleeves rolled, dirt on her palms, humming softly. He knelt beside her, brushing a bit of dirt off a squash leaf. "You hear?" "I did." "I half expected them to bolt," she smiled. "No, you didn't." Reuben chuckled quietly. "No, I didn't." They sat for a moment in the hush of twilight. Jasper's laughter echoed from somewhere near the creek. "You were right," Reuben said. "Sometimes justice don't come with a 6-shooter. June glanced toward the porch. "Sometimes it comes on paper." That night, the sewing porch was full. Not just the usual girls, but mothers too, offering extra thread, old lace, a bowl of soup. Nobody said much, but the air was lighter. Even the banker came by around sundown. He didn't knock. Just left a folded note tucked under a flower pot on the porch. June found it after the girls left. The credit line for Reuben's seed loan had been quietly restored. No signature, just the bank's embossed seal. Reuben read it and handed it back. Still no apology. June folded the note and placed it inside a keepsake tin on the mantel. "Don't need one," she said. "I know who I am. I don't need them to say it." Reuben studied her face, uncovered, proud, lined with scars that caught the last of the firelight. "You sure you want to stay?" he asked softly. June nodded once. "I'm sure." And as night fell, with Jasper tucked into bed and the wind brushing the porch rails, June and Reuben sat together, shoulder to shoulder. Not hiding, not fleeing, just there, 2 people who had stopped running and finally started living. Spring came quiet to Pine Hollow, like a prayer whispered over sleeping soil. It began with frost loosening its grip on the creek bed, then crocuses nudging through thawed earth behind the horse shed. The same shed where Reuben had once laid a tin plate near a stranger wrapped in burlap. The same shed June had buried that burlap sack behind. 6 months. So now, in its place, rows of purple wildflowers bloomed. Messy and uneven, but alive. June knelt there one morning, coaxing a few stubborn seedlings to rise. Jasper ran past her, chasing a paper pinwheel another boy had made at school. He whooped when the wind caught it just right. "Don't lose it near the pigs," June called out, laughing as he darted past the trough. Reuben stood on the porch, whittling a new sign for June's corner shop. He carved slowly, steady, each letter of June's stitchery and trade curved with care. He'd offered to make it official weeks ago, but June had waited until the court handed down a final ruling. Her brothers would serve time, enough to keep them away, for good. Now, she let herself plant things that might last. The porch was different too. The rotted boards had been replaced with fresh cedar. A low awning stretched above, patched from quilt squares donated by the town's sewing circle, some floral, some plain, some stitched with initials from girls who once looked away and now leaned in close, asking June to teach them hems, pleats, and stories. Inside the house, the tin box still sat on the mantel, not as a trophy, but as proof. Next to it, Reuben had placed a hand-drawn map, roads east, places she might want to go. "You don't owe me nothing," he'd said quietly one evening. "If this place ever feels too small, too loud, too watchful, you got options." June had traced the line toward New Mexico, then the coast, but when she looked up, it wasn't the distance that caught her. It was the steadiness in Reuben's eyes. She folded the map and placed it back inside the tin. "This ain't restartin'," she'd told him. "This is just beginnin'." Now, on a Sunday morning soaked in light, the shop porch buzzed with footsteps. Folks came by to trade buttons for bread, lace for apples, or sit a while and ask June what stitch worked best for keeping sleeves from bunching. She answered each question, not with perfection, but with patience. Reuben helped build a second workbench. Jasper stacked bolts of muslin taller than himself, proud and grinning. Later that afternoon, the mayor stopped by, not with a speech, just with his wife's favorite scarf, needing a mend. "You'll fix it?" he asked, sheepish. June nodded once. If the thread's strong, most things can hold. At dusk, Reuben poured 2 mugs of coffee and joined her out front. The wildflowers nodded in the breeze. "I keep thinking how quiet it was when you first got here," he said. June smiled. "Quiet ain't always peace." "No. Sometimes it's just fear wearing a softer coat." She looked out at the field. Not anymore. A wagon rolled by, a young family waving as they passed. The little girl in the back wore a bonnet stitched by June. She lifted it and hollered, "Thank you!" June waved back, blinking at the sun. As evening settled, Jasper came up the porch steps, sticky with plum juice and dirt, and leaned into June's lap. "Can I help you plant more of them flowers?" he asked. She brushed his curls gently. "Yes, baby, but not tonight. Tomorrow's better for roots." He nodded sleepily, already drifting. Reuben rocked his chair slowly, his hand resting on hers. "June, I was thinking, you ever want your name out front here, next to mine? We could make it proper." June looked down at their hands, weathered, scarred, holding steady. "You sure?" she asked. "I ain't just sure," he said. "I'm home." And there, under a porch stitched with grace and shadowed by wildflowers, a man who once lived with ghosts and a woman who had been treated like one sat side by side. No sack, no shame, just roots, and a tomorrow worth waiting for.